All right. Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about Jim Crow laws and the segregated South. Um, let's go ahead and backtrack a little bit and remind ourselves what the situation looked like in America's South after Reconstruction had ended in 1877. Okay, recall that in the 1876 presidential election, it had come down to three states in the South that were disputed because most of the elections in the South were having widespread violence and voter intimidation. You had groups like the KKK intimidating Black voters and keeping them from the polls, regardless of the 15th Amendment. And so there were only three really South Carolina, Louisiana, and of course, Florida. States that still had somewhat of a Reconstructionist, somewhat pro-Black governments in the South. And when those states had disputes over their elections being too close between Tilden, the Democrat, and Hayes, the Republican, the Electoral College could not decide. It wasn't a clear winner. And so in the certification, Congress on January 6, 1877, they decided to basically put together a electoral commission from Congress that would decide the fate of the election. And there were 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats. You'll never guess who they chose. They chose the Republican, Rutherford B. Hayes. And because this was like Civil War Part 2, and the Southerners were all riled up and upset, and now they felt like, oh, not my president, Civil War Part 2, here we go. Hayes is going to make a backdoor deal, kind of like the corrupt bargain of 1824 with John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. Hayes is going to make a backdoor deal with the Democratic leadership and basically assure them that he is not going to be using the United States military to enforce Reconstruction in the South anymore. He will basically give the South back over to these Democrats that had taken control of it again. And these Democrats were called the Redeemers. Remember, these were the former Confederates. These were the people who had taken back control in the 1870s as Reconstruction was ending. And they are going to basically be the ones that claim that the South had been under the horrors of a mismanaged, corrupt government from Northern tyranny during Reconstruction and facing all those carpetbaggers and Black rule basically during Reconstruction. And so those were the Redeemers, and now they have control in the South. And so from 1877 to the 1890s, we see pretty much all of those gains that had happened during the brief window of Reconstruction shrink down, as increasingly Southern states are going to be putting forward harsher and harsher Black codes that were restricting and oppressing African Americans in the South. So that's a little bit of the background. Okay, they're undoing Reconstruction, and probably it was the public school system in the United States that was hit the hardest. In the South, remember, they had just started to have a nascent public school system established at the end of the Civil War with like the Freedmen's Bureau. Freedmen's Bureau was significantly understaffed. You had about 900 workers in the Freedmen's Bureau trying to administer assistance to over 4 million newly freed individuals, trying to give them education, trying to give them medical treatments, trying to ensure they were fed and didn't starve to death during the next winter in 1865, trying also to provide land and a way for these people to make a living for themselves. They were impossibly tasked, but they tried their best. But one of the big successes that was able to come out of the Freedmen's Bureau and from the Reconstruction governments that briefly existed during that window of radical Reconstruction was a public school system for the first time in the South that educated not only poor white children for the first time, but also young African American children who it had been illegal to teach slaves how to read and write before that, before the Civil War. During the time period right after Reconstruction had ended, with that terrible bargain in 1877 that sold the South away, basically, it's the public school system that's going to be hit the hardest. They're not going to be receiving much or any funding from the new Redeemer Southern Democratic white governments that took over. And so, excuse me, a lot of these schools fall by the wayside. They don't have qualified teachers. They're not going to have adequate buildings or utilities or books or anything. And that is something that we see the legacy of today, that Southern schools really lag behind our Northern counterparts. If you look at where each state is ranked in terms of education, you'll notice a trend that most Southern states are ranked pretty low out of the 50 states of the country today. And of course, with a lack of education, a lack of opportunities, and as these Redeemers took back over, and many of them being merchants and tied to the old Southern plantations, the South refused again to diversify its economy, and you're going to have widespread poverty throughout the South. Up through the 1930s, when like Franklin Roosevelt becomes president during the Great Depression, he's going to say, like, and it's true, that the South was the most undeveloped, impoverished region of the country. So many African Americans obviously were feeling like a new form of slavery, or at least serfdom, had developed for them. They were now freed because of the 13th Amendment, and technically the 14th and 15th Amendments were on the books, but all of these had loopholes which the Southern white leadership was exploiting. And so many Blacks seeking to get out of the racist South are going to migrate to wherever they could. And you had a mass exodus. That's when you have a big group leave a place. In 1879 and 1880, I believe, you had this Kansas exodus take place, where you had over 40,000 to almost 100,000 African Americans leave the South. They had Old Pap leader, and several other Black leaders leading them there. And they were told Kansas would kind of be a promised land. Remember last time we talked about Kansas in 1301, it was bleeding Kansas. It was the Civil War beginning there in the 1850s, as Kansas was trying to become a state. But needless to say, Kansas is not going to be the promised land for freedom and equality and opportunity the Blacks were hoping. And many, once they get there, they find that their situation is not vastly improved, but they still choose to remain there rather than go back and face the oppression that was the South, okay? And in the South, you have segregation forming, the Jim Crow laws, as they'll be called, the segregation laws forming by the 1890s, and they start to rev up and become much harsher by the early 1900s. Segregation in the South it's going to become codified. It's going to become by law. And in the North, you also had segregation, of course, taking place. There was segregation in the North even before the Civil War. That will be more de facto segregation versus de jure. And de facto segregation is like not when you're being forced to separate by race, segregate whites only, Blacks only, not based on law, but based on traditions, based on who can afford what or other factors. That's what the segregation looked like in the North. But in the South, it was by law. And you might be asking, how was this able to happen? You know, how were Blacks who had a good deal of authority, even being elected as senators and representatives and state leaders during Reconstruction, how was this allowed to happen? Well, it goes back to enfranchisement, to suffrage, to who has the ability to vote in our country. The vote is so important. There has been so many big things happening as I've been filming these lectures this year of COVID. I'm filming this now on January the 7th, 2021. And yesterday was one of those days. FDR said December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. I think January 6, 2021 will be another date that will live on in infamy in American history books, because we saw the Capitol building of the United States, our sacred temple of democracy, stormed by radical insurrectionists, these supporters of President Donald Trump, who were extremely riled up at a Trump rally early yesterday morning and then unleashed on the Capitol building. They storm it. Capitol Police are, some of them being a little bit too easily shoved aside, and these protesters made their way into the Capitol building as Congress was in a joint session attempting to certify the presidential election, as they always do after presidential elections. We also had the very important Senate races taking place in the state of Georgia, determining which side, Democrats or Republicans, would control the Senate. And the level of bigotry and ignorance on display in our country today, and the violence that is taking place over this ignorance, I think it's really important to understand our history, because obviously a lot of these people don't. They don't understand their government. They don't understand the Constitution. They don't understand or know about their own history. For instance, I saw Confederate flags being waved, as we see at a lot of Trump rallies. And if you ask a Southern person at one of these Trump rallies that's waving that flag, they might argue that that flag represents their Southern heritage, or, you know, their Southern pride in their state, or states' rights, or whatever it was. But for most of the nation, when we see that Confederate flag, and it's the stars and bars, it's not actually the Confederate flag. It's one of the battle flags of the Confederacy. But again, it's ignorance, right? When most of us see that flag and we think of the Civil War, we think of the Confederacy or the South's part in that war, we know that fundamentally the issue that led to the Civil War was the issue of slavery, and whether or not the South would be allowed to keep or maintain the institution of slavery. And these people don't understand that. They don't understand that flag, or maybe they do, maybe they absolutely do, but that flag represents racism, and it represents segregation, and it represents slavery. And it is despicable that this is happening so many years later, that we are constantly refighting the fight of Reconstruction again and again and again in our country. Those who cannot remember the past are being condemned to repeat it. But there we are. Now, ultimately, I think 2021 is hopefully going to be a good year. We see that, Vice President Mike Pence said that regardless of his own personal feelings, he's not going to get in the way of, the American people's decision. And that is ultimately what we are based on. It's populism or power of the people, not to be confused with mob rule. And ultimately, the will of the people did prevail yesterday, or I should say early this morning, as Congress finally certified the election results and upheld the votes of so many millions of Americans that voted in November 2020. But all that being said, votes matter. They are incredibly important. It's your ability to have a say to affect change in this nation. People have fought and died and are still dying over this today. And the way that the Southern white supremacists were able to do all of this marginalization, oppression against African Americans in the late 1800s, early 1900s, was that they denied the right to vote to African American people. Disenfranchisement, that is called. Now recall that in the Reconstruction years, 13th Amendment freed the slaves. The 14th Amendment granted former slaves citizenship. It said anybody born in the United States is a citizen entitled to the same protections as all other citizens. And finally, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, it guaranteed, remember this is when Grant won very narrowly his first election in 1868, Republicans really needed to secure the Black vote to assure they had a majority. So they wanted Blacks to be able to vote. They got the 15th Amendment through Congress during Reconstruction. And that 15th Amendment said that the right to vote will not be denied on the basis of race, which did free up disenfranchisement on the basis of other things besides race. And that is where Southern states will exploit the 15th Amendment, just as they found loopholes for the 13th Amendment. Remember that many of the Black codes included vagrancy laws, which would basically arrest a Black person if they did not provide, or they were not able to provide a work contract and prove that they had a job lined up. They could be arrested, and they would be arrested in large numbers. And once sent to jail, as a loophole of the 13th Amendment, they could be pressed into hard labor. In other words, turned into a slave since they were arrested. And there were so many Blacks filling up the jails in the South because they were being arrested for all sorts of minor infractions. The most petty of crimes would find a Black person in jail. They disproportionately were the ones making up the jails, and thus were the ones being turned into the chain gangs and this slave labor that prisoners often faced in the South. So that's a loophole of the 13th Amendment. A way that Southern states got around the 15th Amendment, which was supposed to secure the right to vote for African American men, was they denied the vote on the basis of literacy or on money or on other things, okay? One of the most common tactics that they used was the poll tax. So polls are the place you go to vote, okay? A poll tax would be a fee, a amount of money you would have to pay in order to be able to vote. Obviously, many African Americans as sharecroppers, basically being modern day or 100 years ago serfs, they were too poor to be able to spend this extra money on voting. And they would be denied the right to vote because they could not afford it. That's a poll tax. Another disenfranchising tactic that was used to keep Blacks from being able to vote and thus deprive them of their rights was the literacy tests. And literacy tests are going to be around for a long time. In fact, they had literacy tests into the 1960s. But a literacy test sounds good on principle that, yeah, a person who's voting, we want them to be able to read and write. But the literacy tests that these Southern states are going to require for voters were targeting Blacks, and specifically giving this test that was nearly impossible to pass to Black people to make sure they would fail it and thus be deprived of their right to vote. And when I say impossible to pass, I mean me as a person with a master's degree in history from the University of London. I've taken a look at like the Louisiana literacy test and stuff. I couldn't pass that thing. It's ridiculous. It's circuitous logic that has you do all sorts of things, and it has a 10-minute time limit. If you make a single mistake, you fail it. It was a test you were literally meant to fail. It was meant to make sure Blacks failed. Now you might be asking, well, didn't whites that, had to take this test, wouldn't they fail too? Yeah, okay. There's going to be in the state of Louisiana from the 1880s to 1900, over 100,000 registered Black voters who will be disenfranchised. They will lose their right to vote because they'll fail these literacy tests or not be able to pay the poll taxes. At the same time, there was 80,000 white voters in the state of Louisiana who also were deprived of their right to vote. So yes, there were many poor whites who also will be disenfranchised because of these tactics. But the Southern elites, this is again going back to like the antebellum period before the Civil War. These are the planter class, the rich elites, the merchants, okay, the ones who controlled the plantations. They don't mind that poor Southern whites can't vote either, okay? They don't mind marginalizing the poor people. They just want to make sure that both groups of poor, white and Black, don't unite. And that was why they had to make sure that racism was always the dividing cause, the thing keeping the poor whites and Blacks from ever coming together and then overtaking the system. So they have the whole thing rigged, basically. And that's how it develops into this terrible Jim Crow segregation that we're going to see. The last really big disenfranchising tactic that was used to deprive Blacks of being able to have any political say or power in this time period is going to be the grandfather clause. And make sure you're aware what that means is that if your grandfather, if your ancestor could vote in the elections before the Civil War, like the 1860 presidential election, then you too could vote. You would be grandfathered in. And of course, the only people that could vote before the Civil War were white people. And so that's also how many whites got around those poll taxes and those literacy tests. So those are some of the disenfranchising tactics that are going to take place. So even though Black men should have had the right to vote because of the 15th Amendment in the late 1800s, we're going to see that that right will be denied through loopholes. In 1896, segregation will become the law of the land through a Supreme Court case, because remember, the Supreme Court is the highest law in our country. There's not a really good place to put my face there. Okay. In this case, Plessy versus Ferguson is one of those really big, really infamous cases. I'd say, personal opinion here, but Dred Scott is probably the worst case that the Supreme Court has ever decided. Their decision in the Dred Scott case is probably the worst decision ever. Plessy versus Ferguson is a pretty close second. Like, it's a pretty bad case, and Korematsu is up there as well. But in Plessy versus Ferguson, this is centered around the state of Louisiana. You have a Black man, by law, he's considered Black, at the center of this case, named Homer Plessy. Now, Homer Plessy in this drawing right here appears very African-American. His skin tone is very dark. But if you see this picture here, which was often confused as being of Homer Plessy, even though it's actually Pinckney Pinchback, the first and only Black governor in the United States of the state of Louisiana back during Reconstruction, he looks white, okay? So Homer Plessy was actually only 1/8 African-American, but according to Louisiana law, which was very similar to other states' laws at the time, if you had any African-American ancestry, you were considered African-American. It didn't matter how light your skin tone was. And so there was also a state law in Louisiana at the time that required African Americans to sit in a segregated train car. They were not allowed to sit with the whites on trains. And so to try to fight this law, a local civil rights group is going to request that Homer Plessy, being a Black man who looks white, they're putting him forward as kind of a test case, they try to get him arrested. And they have him sit at the front of this train car. Sound familiar to Rosa Parks, right? They have him sit at the front of this train car and purposely get arrested. And that is what happens. And his case goes to trial against Judge Ferguson. So that's where you get the name of the case, Plessy versus Ferguson. It makes its way up to the Supreme Court. And in a ruling that was just 8-1, only one dissenting judge, Justice John Marshall Harlan, was the only one who voted against this ruling. The Supreme Court decides that segregation, like on this train car, was perfectly legal, that there was nothing wrong with segregating. And the way that the Supreme Court justified this is they said, yeah, we know the 14th Amendment says that all people born in America are supposed to be citizens and supposed to be treated equally, but just because you're being separated doesn't mean you're not being treated equally. So there's nothing wrong with segregation. That doctrine, established by the Supreme Court in this 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson case, has become known as separate but equal. And it justifies legalized segregation. That is why this case is a terrible, terrible decision by the Supreme Court, because what's immediately going to follow is that all of the southern states are now going to be able to totally legally segregate everything, and that is what they do. Many northern states will also now be able to segregate everything. And so segregation has now become the law of the land because of Plessy versus Ferguson. So remember that doctrine, separate but equal. Now, in the one dissenting justice, they were not unanimous. Justice Harlan said that this was going to be a big mistake, that America being founded as a place of equality, this goes in direct contradiction to that ideal, that we are not living up to our equality here, and he's right. But again, we're going to have to wait till the second Reconstruction, the civil rights era of the 1950s and 60s before we get any changes to this. In fact, it won't be until the Supreme Court case of Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka in 1954 that they will finally overturn this terrible, terrible decision of separate but equal. And when I say segregated, I'm sure most of you have seen the pictures and you're aware, but segregation means that the races were kept separate, that blacks and whites had different facilities and spheres, and blacks were restricted to only going to those things which were black only. You could see like the water fountains, you could see pictures, if you look them up, of schools, libraries, theaters, any public space was segregated. And they were legally allowed to do so because remember, the Supreme Court decision basically overturns the Civil Rights Act of 1875. And typically the problem with this, the reason why it doesn't make any sense, separate but equal, is that it was never equal. When they segregated these facilities, like the water fountains right here, it was always the case the blacks would either not have anything, or what they would get in their segregated facilities would be far inferior to what the whites would get. And nowhere is that more evident than in public schools, where you would have whites having beautiful, brand new brick schools with many floors and overflowing with brand new textbooks and qualified teachers and lights and electricity eventually, once we have electricity, and all these things, and running water. And the black schools would be a little, ditch somewhere, or a little shack, okay? It might have said under the law that separate was to be equal, but that was never really the reality. Now, during this time period, of course, you did have many black leaders who sought to fix things. So I call these guys the early civil rights leaders, because we're not yet to the really big civil rights era. Again, that's going to be in the 1950s and 60s. But one of the early civil rights leaders that you definitely need to be aware of is Booker T. Washington. He was born as a slave, didn't live for very long as a slave. He was born in the 1850s, but his mother was the slave. His father was, as is pretty typical, his white slave master. So he was of mixed race. And he was freed by the 13th Amendment. So he grew up in the South. He had that background. And he was incredibly bright and self-taught. And eventually, his father did pay for him to have some education. And what Booker T. Washington is going to do is he's kind of going to take the place of Frederick Douglass as the national spokesman and champion and advocate for African Americans. Because Frederick Douglass dies at the end of the century in the 1890s. And that is when Booker T. Washington is really emerging as a leader of Black people. He gives a famous speech in Atlanta, Atlanta, Georgia, where he talks about his idea of accommodation. Now, a lot of people accuse Booker T. Washington of being a coward or other things. He had a much slower approach than, to say, other civil rights leaders such as Ida B. Wells or W.E.B. Du Bois. But what Washington was very aware of was the danger that his people faced if they spoke out. This was at a time period when lynchings or murders by mobs, hangings or however they would kill you, were very, very commonplace for anybody who stuck their neck out, who tried to change the status quo or change the system, basically. And to avoid violence against his people, his slow approach to try to have African Americans achieve equality and end the segregation basically said that in the short term, African Americans needed to accept segregation. They needed to be okay with it. And slowly over time, build up their communities, build up their neighborhoods, and most importantly, build up their businesses. And the way for African Americans to get good, high-paying jobs was to get a sort of trade school or vocational education. This is like in our Waco area, the difference between going to school at like MCC and then transferring to Baylor versus going to school just at TSTC. If you go MCC and Baylor and stuff, you're likely getting a more academic education, studying the fine arts, getting an English degree or a master's in history, right? And it takes years and years to do that, but you're not guaranteed to get a good job, or if you are, it'll take a long time. Versus a trade school, you go to school for about 2 years or maybe less, and you're immediately going to get those skills to get a good high-paying job as soon as you get out of that trade school. So like at TSC, you learn to become a welder, or you learn computer skills, and you can get a job that'll pay $20 an hour or so. So Booker T. Washington was advocating for young Blacks to get that trade education so that they could get good, high-paying jobs very quickly, start to make some money, start to be able to set up their own businesses, have those businesses flourish and grow, and more businesses be able to serve, you know, not just Blacks, but whites as well. This is the time period when you had the Black Wall Street in like Tulsa, Oklahoma growing. My lights just went out. Hold on just a second, sorry. Sorry about that. Filming this during my conference. And eventually that Blacks would be able to achieve equality over maybe a generation or two. It would take a long time, but there would be no need for segregation when you had Blacks living more comfortably and living, you know, at an advanced standard of living, at the same standard of living as whites. Then you would achieve that equality without having to fight, without having to risk losing people, without having to risk being lynched. That was Booker T. Washington's approach, and that's known as accommodation. That was from this famous speech that he gave in Atlanta. And Booker T. Washington, he was very charming, just like Frederick Douglass. He was an amazing speech giver, and he was very funny. A lot of his jokes were very racist. They were very crude humor and other things. He could have a whole crowd of Blacks and whites, you know, starting off real tense and then just laughing along with them. He was a great leader, but he was living at a time when the odds were definitely stacked against him. And so that was why he had this much slower approach to equality. Booker T. Washington was also famously invited to the White House during the presidency of the early 1900s of Teddy Roosevelt or Theodore Roosevelt. And this lunch at the White House, you know, you had Black leaders like Frederick Douglass go to the White House before to have meetings with the president. Frederick Douglass met twice with Abraham Lincoln. But this was the first time that a Black person, well, at least an African-American person, was invited to the White House on a personal invitation of the president to have a meal, you know, personal meal with the president of the United States. And the country like exploded. The South went crazy at this. And Teddy Roosevelt actually had to backtrack the entire lunch and say, oh, no, I just invited him over for a working meeting. We didn't actually hang out. That just goes to show you the level of racism indicative in American society, especially in the South at this time. And I say at this time, you know, it obviously hasn't gone away. The other really important civil rights leader you need to be aware of at this time, he's a little bit younger and he's from the North, is this guy named W.E.B. Du Bois. And Du Bois, I'm gonna run out of time. Du Bois was an African-American man who had been born into an integrated community in Massachusetts. He was able to attend Harvard. He became the first African-American to graduate from Harvard. And he didn't grow up in the segregation and slavery that Booker T. Washington did. Du Bois believed in the talented tenth, that the smartest African-Americans would be able to lead the rest. And he's going to help to establish the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. This is a civil rights organization that is still around today that has helped to achieve equality. They were behind getting the lawyers like Thurgood Marshall to fight the Brown versus Board of Education case to end segregation in all public schools in the United States. And W.E.B. Du Bois is also going to be instrumental in the Niagara movement, which was about Black power, and the Harlem Renaissance, which was about spreading the idea of Black empowerment, Black culture, Black literature, and other things. So he is an intellectual, and we'll be talking more about him for sure later on. For W.E.B. Du Bois, he believed that equality shouldn't have to wait. Equality should come now because African Americans had already achieved it under the laws, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. It was just about securing those rights. One of the people that helped him to found the NAACP was this amazing woman right here, Ida B. Wells. She was a newspaper editor in Tennessee, had been born right before the Civil War. Her newspaper was actually burned down by white supremacists after she wrote several editorials condemning the practice of lynchings. Remember, lynching typically done by hanging, but it could be done in other ways. This is a murder by a mob. And this is how many Southern white supremacists would spread fear and terror and oppress African Americans. And they often justified it as justice, usually done, you know, a defense of poor Southern white women who were being raped by evil African American men. But Ida B. Wells, as a muckraker, an investigative journalist getting to the heart of the truth, she actually went in and investigated these murders. And her reports she published in these editorials stated that no, this wasn't justice that was being done. This was mob rule. This was oppression of African Americans to terrorize the Black community and keep them oppressed. And she was a very brave woman who devoted her whole life to the anti-lynching crusade, to trying to achieve greater rights for African Americans, for women, and for suffrage. And we'll be talking more about her as well. All right, we're going to stop there because I got my next class coming in. Thank you guys very much, and I will talk to you later. Goodbye.